mother who truly is a mother. And today I was going to talk about enduring, faith to strength to endure, but I decided I would go to the book of Esther instead. And I'm not talking about Aunt Esther. If you know about Sanford and Son, I bet some of you young folks don't even know what Sanford and Son is. Sanford and Son was a show that was on years ago, and Fred Sanford, he liked to mess with his sister-in-law. His wife had died, but his sister-in-law would come around, and they called her Aunt Esther. And she would call him a heathen, and he would call her, and she would call him a fish-eyed fool, and he'd call her stuff like Godzilla and all kinds of stuff. And so we're not talking about that Esther today, okay? Let's be clear. If you have your Bibles, turn to the book of Esther. And I would give you the page number, but I know it's not the same as my Bible. But Esther was a remarkable, remarkable woman. And Esther's parents were gone. And she was raised by her uncle, Mordecai. But just to give you a little bit of the history, King Xerxes was ruling he ruled over 127 provinces that stretched from India to Kush, and that's the Upper Nile region, or where the Nile River is, I guess around Egypt. But King Xerxes was married to Queen Vashti. I may have butchered her name, but it's Vashti. Vashti, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. And she was beautiful, but the king decided he's going to throw a party, a banquet, and the queen decided she's going to throw a banquet for all the ladies. Well, it came a point that the King Xerxes wanted to show Vashti off, so he sends for her to come to present her to the people. Well, she didn't come. And that just didn't set right with King Xerxes, because it was dishonoring to him to have his queen not come when he called. So he calls all his people around and he says, "What should I do?" And they said, "Well, she disrespected you. She disrespected all the nobles from the region, so you can do something." So he banished her from the kingdom, and he took away her royal title. Well, this left a vacancy. And so Mordecai he tells Esther, who was a Jew, and King Xerxes was not a Jew. They were not they were not there with the Jews at this time. And he tells Esther, and that wasn't her born name, but that she had another name, which I can't see it right now. But anyway, I'm just going to summarize the story, and then we're going to get into the meat of what I want to say. But he tells her not to tell, the kingdom, the king and everybody, that she is a Jew. And he instructs her on how she should act. And something we need to understand about Esther. Esther was a fox. Esther was beautiful. And so, the king decides, okay, King Xerxes, after he got through being upset for a few days, he said, okay, I need to get me another queen. So he sends out his officials, and they go, getting all the young ladies and bringing them to the kingdom. And they send them through a treatment. They sent the ladies through a beauty treatment for 12 months before they could even be presented to the king. They treated their skin with this special oil and all this stuff, and makeups and all whatever they did, and to make sure that these ladies were the most beautiful they could be. Well, it came time that they would present the ladies to the king. And so they bring them in there, and it says that look at, if you've got your Bible, we'll look at Esther 2, verse 15. It says, when the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, it said, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. And she was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king, he looked at her and his eyes popped out of his head. And he's like, man, I got to have this woman. This girl's beautiful. And it says that he was attracted to her more than to any of the other women. And she won his favor. And so he set a royal crown on her head. And he made her queen instead of Vashti. Now the king gave a great banquet. And Esther's banquet for all his nobles and officials, he proclaimed a holiday, this is verse 18, throughout the provinces, and he distributed gifts with royal liberality. Well, Mordecai, the man who raised Esther, he hears something. He finds out that two of the king's guards, or two of the officials, are wanting to kill King Xerxes. I mean, if you read the Bible, there's all kinds of stories in here. There's all kinds of plots. I mean, the queen being kicked out of the kingdom because she wouldn't come to the king, being stripped of her rights. Here you got two of the royal officials that plot to murder King Xerxes. Well, Mordecai heard the story, and he tells Esther, and Esther goes and tells the king, and they hang those two officials that were going to kill the king. Well, there was another guy that came up, and he was one of the officials in the city, or in this province. His name was Haman. Look at your neighbor and say, Haman was a bad dude. We talking a bad dude. He was badder than bad Leroy Brown. He was a bad dude. Well, it says in chapter 3, and I'm going to be jumping around because there was like 7 chapters, okay? I didn't want you to have to sit through me reading it all. It says, after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha. And I know I probably butcher these names, but bear with me. The Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down to pay him honor. Boy, Haman's head was as big as this room. Haman had been exalted to this high position. He had been honored by the king. And Mordecai had the audacity not to kneel down and pay honor to Haman. Look at your neighbor and say, Haman got mad. Haman got mad. Praise you, Jesus. And it says that Haman came up with this plan. And he got upset because Mordecai, the Jew, did not kneel. And he wanted to kill him. He wanted to get rid of him. But instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews. The Jews have been persecuted all throughout history. And it says in the 12th month, look at verse 7 of chapter 3, in the 12th month, or 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, they cast the pur, that is the lot, in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there's a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the man who carries out this business. So the king took the signet ring off his finger. He took the royal ring, placed it on Haman's finger, the enemy of the Jews. And he said, keep the money and do with these people as you please. So Haman was a bad dude. Haman got mad at Mordecai. And so he decided to get even with Mordecai. He's going to go out and he's going to wipe out all the Jews that are dispersed in the kingdom. Haman doesn't know that the queen is a Jew because the queen kept quiet because Mordecai had instructed her, do not tell anybody that you're a Jew. So Haman's got this royal ring, and now he's there, and he's got power. And he starts going out and persecuting and killing the Jews. Mordecai's disturbed because his people are being killed. And chapter 4 says, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the city, and he wailed loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter in. And in every province to which the edict or order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay on sackcloth and ashes. It was a sad day. It was a day of fear, distress, because Haman, this wicked, wicked man, had got the king, King Xerxes, by telling him that these people disrespected him and dishonored him. He had got the king to allow him to go out and kill these people. It says when Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of the sackcloth, but he would not accept them. He kept on mourning. He kept on grieving. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So he goes out and he finds Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened, including the amount of money that Haman had promised to pay for any person that carried out this destruction of the Jews. And he also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for the annihilation that had been sent out, the annihilation of the Jews. I mean, when somebody's going to annihilate somebody, they're going to wipe them out. Haman, this wicked, wicked man, he wanted to annihilate all the Jews. To annihilate means to wipe off the face of the earth. Do you see why I said Haman was a wicked man? Haman was not, he definitely was not a godly man. Do you know there's a lot of antichrists that have lived throughout history? And you know that this man Haman was a type of antichrist? I mean, Jesus had not come to the earth then as far as to die for us. But God still had his plan in place, and God had promised that he was going to send his son through the Jews. And this man Haman wanted to wipe out all of God's people, all of the Jews. So Haman was a type of antichrist at that time. Because Satan thought by wiping out the Jews, he could stop what God had planned. Look at your neighbor and say, you can't stop what God's going to do. Do you believe it today? Do you believe that no plan of the Lord's can be stopped? So Mordecai tells this eunuch, this servant, this maid servant of Esther, or this servant of Esther, he tells the servant what was going on. She in turn goes and tells Queen Esther. And it says that then she instructed him, if you look down at chapter 4, verse 10 of Esther, it says, then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and all the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the golden scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So Mordecai wanted Esther to go to the king, to King Xerxes, her husband, and do something to try to stop this craziness. But Queen Esther says, I can't go in unless he extends his royal scepter to me. If I go in, even though I'm the queen, I mean, she knows what happened to the first queen. She knows that, I mean, she wasn't killed, but she was kicked out of the kingdom and lost her royal status. And if she went in without invitation, she would be killed. And she said, I can't go in unless he invites me. He hasn't invited me in about 30 days. So I can't help you now. But it says, if you look at verse 12, it says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. He said, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. In other words, Mordecai said, when they find out you're a Jew, don't you think you're going to be in trouble too? Said, if you remain silent this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. In other words, Mordecai tells her, this woman who was a queen, he raised like a daughter, says, if you keep quiet, you're going to be killed, but God's still going to send relief because God's going to take care of his people. So God's still going to look after us. Well, it says that. So then Esther said this. Where'd that come from? Esther said this. Sound like Gomer Pyle up here preaching for a minute. But it says, and who knows, if you look at the last part of verse 14, it says, and who knows but that you have come to royal positions for such a time as this. Esther, God may have raised you up. You, this Jewish girl in this kingdom that hates Jews. Say, God may have raised you up for this very moment, for such a time as this. I'm going to tell you something. Some of you sitting here today, you may be in places in your life where God is calling you. And I've made right decisions, I've made wrong decisions in my life. But every time I took a wrong turn, God had a way of trying to direct me and steering me right to the path that He wanted me to be on. And some of you here are the same way. Maybe you've been through some roads that are pretty lonely and been pretty tough. But now you're at a place in your life to where God has positioned you for a specific purpose. Look at your neighbor and say, God may have you here at this time for something special. God may have a plan for you, something that only you can carry out. Do you know God made each one of you unique? Look at your neighbor and say, I'm unique. So God made you unique, and God may have positioned you where you are right now, this very moment, for a specific reason. So Mordecai sent this reply and said, if you don't help, you'll be killed like the rest of us when they find out you're a Jew. But you may be put here. God may have put you here for such a time as this. This may be the very moment that God raised you up and gave you this royal status. Well, verse 15, it says, Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, said, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will gather to the king, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Okay, I'm going to go. I'm going to go to the king. It may cost me my life, but I'm going to go. Whatever happens, let it happen. In chapter 5, and I'm going to jump around here too. It says, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes. She made herself look just the best she could. Like I say, Esther was a beauty queen. She was a fox. She made herself look as beautiful as she could, putting on royal robes and everything. And she stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. Yeah, she went just close enough that the king could see her. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, and he was facing the entrance, right where he could see Esther. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased by her beauty and everything. It's okay. She's okay. But he was pleased by her beauty. And so he holds out his royal scepter to Esther, telling her, come on, you have my permission. Come into my presence. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. It says, then the king asked, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. if it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Bring Haman at once. Look at your neighbor and say, Haman's that wicked dude. So she tells the king, I want you and Haman to come to a banquet that I prepared. And you're thinking, why would she prepare a banquet for this wicked, wicked man? This man that's trying to wipe out her people. Why would she prepare a banquet for him? Well, it says that after she invited the king and Haman to this banquet, it says, so the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared, and as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is it? What's your petition? It will be given you, and what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Well, Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet. I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. So Esther wouldn't tell him what was going on until he came. Well, old Haman, he was cockier than a peacock. Yeah, I said a while ago, Haman's head was swelled as big as this room, this sanctuary. Well, Haman, he got all excited, and he's going around. He went out, and he's happy, and he's all excited, and he goes around, and he sees Mordecai. Mordecai's at the king's gate, and Mordecai didn't rise up in the presence of Haman. He didn't show fear that Haman was there. And old Haman, this wicked, wicked man, Haman, he's upset, and he gets mad. He's full of rage. I'm going to get that Mordecai. How dare him? How dare Mordecai not show me honor? I am somebody. Y'all bear with me. This is not in your text. This is my paraphrase, so just bear with me in that. But you can picture it. Oh, Haman's, he's mad. He's mad. Because Haman thinks he is what? He thinks he is somebody. Well, Haman didn't say anything. He restrained from saying anything to Mordecai or doing anything at that moment. And it says in the last part of verse 10, it says, calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the way the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all. Haman added, I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. It says his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it, then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. So Haman, he's going around, I'm special. I'm special. I'm special. I'm the only one that Queen Esther invited along with the king to come to the banquet. I'm special. I'm so special. And he really got happy when his friends and his wife told him, so why don't you build a gallows and just get the king. You know, the king will do whatever you want because you're so, what? Special. So he has the gallows built. But that night, the king couldn't sleep. Looking at chapter 6. It says the king couldn't sleep that night. And he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought to him. And he read it. And he found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bethana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway and who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. So he reads that it was recorded that Mordecai had saved his life. Look at your neighbor and say, Mordecai was a hero. And so he starts trying to decide, and if you look at verse 3 of chapter 6, it says, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. And they told him, said, nothing's been done for him. Well, the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Well, the king says, bring him to me. And when Haman entered, the king asked him, he said, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Well, who do you think the Haman thought he was talking about? I mean, Haman's head's this big, right? Haman thought he's talking about him. He thought he was going to be honored. So the king said, what shall I do to the man who the king's going to honor? And Haman, thinking it was him, because Haman was thinking, who is it the king would want to honor more than me? Because I am what? Special. So he says this, he says, looking at verse 7, he answered the king and he says, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Do you see that? Haman, who thought he was what? Who thought he was special. He tells the king to give him a robe he's worn, put him on one of his horses, decorate him up and just parade him around and let everybody see how special he is. But Haman was going to be surprised. Look at your neighbor and say, Haman was surprised. Okay, it says, the king said in verse 10, chapter 6, verse 10 of Esther, said, go at once, the king commanded Haman, get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai. The one that Haman, who thought he was so special, went to the king to ask the king to hang. The king tells him to go and do all this stuff that he thought he was going to get done to himself. He tells him to go do it to the one that he counted as an enemy, Mordecai. And said he's sitting at the gate, go do everything that you have said should be done. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. Could you imagine how that made Haman feel? Haman hates. Look at your neighbor and say, Haman hates Mordecai. Haman hated him. And now the king's telling him to go do all the stuff that he wanted done to him. Go do it to the person he hated. You know what I think? I know this was this king that didn't know God and all this stuff that agreed to do this stuff. But you know what I think? This shows a picture of how God is going to take care of us and how He will turn things on our enemies when we live for Jesus and we're faithful to Him. Did you hear what I said? Last week I talked about, or in the Bible study we've been doing in Thessalonians, it talked about how God would repay trouble to those who trouble you. But He would give good things to us who are His servants, His children. So I think that could be kind of a picture of how God turns things around. But it says this, so Haman in verse 11 got the robe and the horse. He rode Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Could you imagine that? I could just see it. I could just see the expression on Haman's face. Because he hates Mordecai. And he's having to parade him through the city on this royal horse. This is what the king does for the man he wants to honor. Verse 12, it says, after Mordecai returned to the king's gate, or afterward Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. See, he still thinks he's being honored. Chapter 7, verse 1, it says, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. And then it says, then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. I say she was a Jew like the rest of them that was being killed. And she also said, and spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. But Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. It's this snake over here, Haman. He's the one that did it. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Could you imagine his face? Haman thought he was what? Haman thought he was special. Not only did he have to parade around Mordecai, whom he hated, and he paraded him around looking like a king. Now he's just had the king told of how wicked this man really is, or he is. And so Haman was scared to death. I can just picture this Haman up there. He's probably shaking. He's fearful. And it says in verse 7 of chapter 7 of Esther, the king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was fallen on the couch where Esther was reclining. Look at the person beside you and say, Haman was scared. He was groveling. And so Haman falls on the couch where Esther was at, begging, hoping to find mercy with Queen Esther so he can spare his life. But the king sees him falling on the couch with his wife, with the king's wife, and the king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while he's with me in the house? How dare he? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Hardana, one of the eunuchs, attending the king, said, a gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. And the king said, hang him on it. Hang that ugly rascal. I don't think God's going to be mad at me for adding some humor in this story, okay? As long as I don't change it and try to mess with the gospel. Hang him. Hang him high. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. And the king's fury subsided. Who was the gallows built for? Mordecai. Who was it that got hanged on it? That wicked, wicked man Haman. God turned it around. Look at your neighbor and say, God turned it around. God had carried out on the enemy of the Jews the fate that this wicked man Haman had in store for Mordecai. God turned it around, and Haman was hung on his own gallows. God's got a plan. God's got a plan, and you know what? There's no devil in hell that can stop the plan of God. Had Esther refused to go into the king because of fear, God would have found a way to save his people, because God's plan cannot be what? Stopped. But Esther did go in, and God gave her favor, and God used her for such a time as this. Such a time as this. Yeah, Esther could have been up there, and she could have got mad and said, what good's it going to do me to be a queen, when as soon as they find out I'm a Jew, they're going to strip me of my title and I'm going to be dead. You could be in your situation right now. Whatever it is, you could be placed in a position to where it may be a little uncomfortable. And you could be thinking, what next? Why am I here? What next? Or you can put your eyes on the Lord and say, I'm going to be faithful. If I perish, I perish, but I'm going to be faithful. Did Esther perish because of her decision to go to the king? No, the king gave her favor. And Mordecai was saved as well as the Jewish people. Where has God placed you? Where has God placed you right now in your life? Are you at a place to where you're ready to give up? Things are heating up around you and you're ready to give up? Or are you at the place to put your eyes on Jesus and say, Lord, whatever you have, here I am. Whatever you're calling me to, here I am. Perhaps God has placed you where you are, or placed us here for such a time as this. We were on Highway 52 for almost 20 years. God stirred some things up, and I thought it was the enemy trying to stop us from doing what God wanted us to do. But God had a plan. Look at your neighbor and say, God had a plan. He gave us a nudge in the seat of the pants. He opened up this property. He moved us here. And God put us here for such a time as this. And I'm going to tell you something. How do we know what God is going to do? We know it by keeping our eyes on Jesus, by getting His Word in our heart, and by stepping out every day in obedience to Him. Inch by inch, it's a cinch. One step at a time. And God will take you to the place that He's calling you to. How do you know that God has not put you in the place you are right now? Because there are people around you that He wants to make an impact in their life through you. Or perhaps God has placed you where you are right now so that people that He has placed around you can make an impact in your life to help you to get up and move on with Him. Perhaps He's called you for such a time as this. Looking at chapter 8, and I'm going to be finishing soon, but chapter 8, verse 1, it says, the same day King Xerxes, this is the same day that he hanged Haman, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her, and the king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed. The king had took the signet ring, his royal ring, off of Haman's finger before they hang him. And now he takes that ring and he presents it to the man that Mordecai wanted to kill. He gives it to Mordecai. And Queen Esther appointed Mordecai over Haman's estate. God will pay back double, or pay back the enemy for the trouble they cause against His people. It says Esther, verse 3 of chapter 8, said Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman, which he had devised against the Jews. And the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. It says, if it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it is the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, and Agagite devised and wrote to destroy the Jews and all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, For no document written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring can be revoked. At once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, and the month of Sivan. They wrote out all of Mordecai's orders to Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush, or around Egypt. Their orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches from the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred by the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy and kill and annihilate any army, force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. Hallelujah. Look at your neighbor and say, God did it. God did it. God protected His people. And He did it through a beautiful young lady named Esther. Ladies, don't think God can't use you. Don't think God doesn't have a plan for you. God's faithful. If it had not been for Queen Esther stepping up, many, many more of the Jewish people would have been killed. But Esther stood up. This godly, God-fearing woman stepped up. This Jewish lady. She stepped up. And God used her to save the Jewish people. You know what? Ladies, I'm here to tell you today, I mean men too, but especially today, this is Mother's Day. Ladies, I want you to know that you're special. Men, you're special, but ladies, you are special. God has called you. In the last days, the Lord said He would pour out His Spirit on all flesh, and He would say that even sons and daughters both would prophesy. I'm here to tell you today that God may have put you here for such a time as this. Do you know that, look at your neighbor and say, you were born for this time. Yeah, I've often looked at the chaos and the craziness of the world and thought, man, I would love to have been born 100 years ago. Or even go back to, the time when more people went to church and more people called themselves Christians and even more people acted like it. But the bottom line is this: God has placed you here. He has placed us here for such a time as this. Do you know that God ordained for you to be born at this very moment? Or not this moment, but this age, okay? I'm not sitting here looking at a bunch of babies out here. Although I love our babies we do have. So precious. So precious. But you know what? The question is this: what are you going to do with the position God has placed you in? Are you going to get a woe is me attitude like Queen Esther could have done? Queen Esther could have said, I'm in the palace, but it's just a matter of time before they come and kill me too. She could have been in despair and distress and done nothing, and just went out, oh! Woo! Wah! Woe is me! But she didn't. She chose to step up. and she chose to be faithful. And God honored that. Look at the person beside you and say, God honors faithfulness. What is it that God's called you to today? What is it that God's called you to today? Are you dragging your feet with some things that God's told you? Are you in a position in your life where you think all's lost and you're missing the very purpose that you are right where you are? Or are you stepping out and realizing that God placed you there for such a time as this? And Jameson, you know you're special. Jensen, you know you're special. Do you know God placed you here for such a time as this? Look at the person beside you and say, you know that God loves you? No weapon formed against me shall prosper. God is faithful. Esther was faithful, and Esther stepped up. And God used Queen Esther to deliver this woman who was an orphan, basically. She didn't have a mama or a daddy to raise her. Mordecai stepped in and adopted her and raised her. This woman that could have fell by the wayside, God raised her up. God took care of her, and God raised her to the place of delivering His people. Such a time as this, I want everybody here to start asking God, Lord, have you put me here for such a time as this? Help me not to miss the reason I'm here. Help me to be faithful. Praise you, Jesus. Not only did God save the Jewish people, God also exalted Mordecai to greatness there in that heathen kingdom of King Xerxes. Today I want us to go to the Lord in prayer. Everybody close your eyes, bow your heads, and let's ask the Lord today, Lord, have you put me here for such a time as this? The place you put me in my life, am I here for a reason? Is there a purpose you have placed me here? Is there something that you want to do in the midst of where I am right now? God wants you to know that I don't believe there's any accidents. I believe that God has a divine plan for your life, and I believe He has called you for a purpose. I don't care where you've been. I don't care how many times you've failed in the past. God wants you to know that He has called you. He has not given up on you. He loves you. If you still got breath in your body today, God still has a purpose for you. God still has a plan for your life. Today, I want to challenge you to move into all God has for you. I want to challenge you to step into the moment right now, right where God has you. Say, Lord, whatever you've called me to, that's what I want. I desire you above everything else. So, Lord Jesus, I submit everything to you. I surrender all to you. When Queen Esther made the decision that she was going to go to the king and take a chance on whether he extended his royal scepter to invite her into his throne, around his throne, She was basically saying, I'm all in. She said, whatever happens, happens. She said, I'm all in. Today, I want to ask you this. God is sending out this call to you. And He wants you to know, He wants to ask you this. Are you all in? Are you all in for His purpose for your life? Are you all in? What is your decision today? Are you all in? Or are you just going to stick your toe in and say, well, I like to feel the water on my toe, but I'm afraid to go anymore? The river of living water is meant to be overflowing. The river of living water is the life of God flowing into you. And in order to experience the full flow of the river of God, we have to be all in. I want to ask you today, are you all in today with God? Because if you're all in, it's time to let God get know and surrender all to Him. Today, as we worship the Lord, and we got